Good morning, friends. WordofGord OBE Journal, number 16, I believe. We've touched on retrieval work a couple of times during this series so far, and we will probably, touch on it again. Retrievals from natural disasters, and disasters are perhaps more man-made than natural, but the experience is quite similar. And I've commented on this, described it, commented, and I think it would be good to refer back to one of my, not my only, but one of my early teachers, Bruce Moen, who certainly illustrated and extended and inspired my own fledgling work. And when I say fledgling, I mean in terms of consciousness. Underlining what I've said many times before, and it's directly from my own experience as well as a philosophical view. As you learn things from facilitators, from websites, from books, you find out that, hey, this is easier than I thought it was. Or, how come I'm so attuned to this work? Essentially, it is because what you do when you're in an astral or a mental body, i.e. not physical, is much more than you think you can do, or ever suspected that you could do. And it's more a process of remembering, as Plato once said, knowledge is remembering, than discovering. Well, it is sort of a discovery, but it is essentially discovering territory that you'd been in before and forgotten about. And this cannot be emphasized enough. So in my own first book, I talk about my guide, that's Eternal Life and How to Enjoy It, my guide Henry showing me the ropes on disaster retrievals, and me Gordon not being very good first time out, or what it seemed like first time out. And I got better, as we all do. And then at some point shortly thereafter that, I think I discovered Bruce's website and first book, which is Voyages into the Unknown, Exploring the Afterlife series, just as I was finishing my own first book, something like that. And as those of you who have read my second book, More Adventures in Eternity, will know that I fully plunged into reading his work and contributing and studying his website, afterlifeknowledge.com. And I thank some of the people that contributed to that and helped shape my own thought and experience on the matters arising. In his own first book, there's a good introduction that will remind you of this whole situation where I'm, encouraging you to not do much of a practice or a ritual, but to project your consciousness from a calm, seated state. Well, Bruce did that as well. And after he'd taken courses at Monroe and used the hemisync tapes and sat in a darkened check unit and, practiced, he got so that, as they say in Monroe speak, you get so you take the training wheels off and you just sort of wing it and do it. And his first book begins with this, and it definitely deeply affected me. at the time. Of course, you realize, well, I can't do that right now, but maybe I'll do it one day. And yeah, of course you do. And I did, but it took a while. And it might take you a while too, but it needn't take you the bigger while that it took me. Let's hope the 100th monkey effect really is true, and I think it is. Maybe you'll be one of the 100th monkeys and learn really quick. And on the other hand, don't punish yourself if it doesn't happen really quick. You know, go at your own pace. Anyway, I'm going to read a little bit of this because I think it's highly relevant. It's not only to doing retrievals and splitting your consciousness between here and there and projecting and realizing that even though you're preoccupied here, awake, not asleep, you can project there, and the bit of you that's there can act creatively. While the bit of you that's here might be doing something fairly mundane, but preoccupied. For several years I'd been sailing, this is Bruce now, back and forth between this world and the afterlife. Ashore on many uncharted islands I'd search for hidden treasures, as I call the knowledge my exploring brings. On some, my discoveries showed that there was a lot more to learn. The terrorist bombing in Oklahoma City on April 19, 1995 proved just such an island. I was working as a contract engineer in Colorado. Word of the bombing started floating through the office in the late morning. Early reports said that many people had been killed, but none of us knew the extent of the carnage. Learning to assist people who have just recently died was how I first learned to explore the afterlife. So I had brief thoughts that there might be some way I could help those who had been killed. I decided to try and do something when I got home from work. As I drove the freeway home that night, NPR radio filled me in with more details. It was pretty clear by the time I switched on the television in my apartment that many, many people had died. As darkness approached, I began to feel a restless, raspy, fidgety energy that seemed to fill the air around me. A strong desire to be with other people pulled me out to our nearby Bennigan's restaurant for dinner. At least there, the loud music and noisy, crowded atmosphere matched the energy I felt surrounding me when I was alone at home. Sitting at a small table by myself, I'd just finished placing my order for our seafood platter when I remembered earlier thoughts about trying to assist victims of the bombing. Still thinking it was something I'd actually do later, I sat on a stool in Bennigan's, quietly expressing my willingness to provide assistance. That's how it always starts, willingness. I just expressed the intent to proceed. I thought I'd have plenty of time to finish my meal, go home, lie down, and then begin to carry out my intent to assist. I have done such things before, and it has always worked out just fine. And after in the months after reading this, I learned how to do that myself. And you would have that experience. You'd think about it during the workday, either a single retrieval, single contact, or a quote-unquote disaster, tragedy. But hidden treasure is a tricky thing. You're never sure what you're going to find. Moments after expressing my willingness to assist, I felt the voice of Coach, a non-physical friend you'll come to know later. Amidst the overtly loud music and many people's voices, I focused on Coach's voice. Okay, Bruce, I felt him saying, they can use the help. In the next instant, sitting on a tall stool in Bennigan's and remaining aware of those surroundings, suddenly I was also rushing through blackness towards 3 infants who had died in the blast. As I approached, I could see them sitting close together, seemingly unharmed and perhaps a little dazed. I'd never retrieved more than one person at a time before, but this didn't seem much different. Besides, these were babies, and I could easily hold all 3 of them together in my arms. I scooped the babies up into my arms and spun around, feeling for the direction of the reception center. The reception center is a port of entry for the newly deceased in the afterlife. Whatever needs they will have will be provided for in this calm setting with a familiar earth-like appearance. For some who arrive here, those include soothing the trauma of dying. The helpers there are good at that. They get lots of practice. The reception centre on Focus 27 area of the afterlife looks very much like a physical world. The park there has grass, trees, sidewalks, benches, flower gardens, and as on every previous trip I'd made there, I knew people would be waiting when I arrived. They would take these babies in and then begin the process of helping them adjust to their new lives in the new world. As the reception centre came into view, I could see people standing on the grass in the park waiting. Out of my habit of always trying to get verification information, I tried to get identities of some of those people waiting on the ground. I felt aunts, uncles, and non-related volunteer helpers take the babies from my arms. I paused for a moment, again out of habit, to imprint in memory the impressions I'd received about those who had been waiting. Then I turned around, focused on the location of the blast site, and accelerated into the blackness again. In the few seconds before my arrival, I checked and noted I was feeling little emotion as a result of what I had just done. There were some feelings of sadness for the baby's early loss of life, but not much more. Several more quick trip pace followed as I went back and forth to the blast site. The first few trips were with children, ages maybe 2 to 8. Out of habit, I continued to gather and store in memory impressions that might be useful later to verify what I thought I was doing. Early in my training, gathering verifiable information was important to me. I needed proof I wasn't all making it up. I'd gotten that proof so many times by now that there was no real need to continue gathering data, but some old habits just become so ingrained you continue to do them without thinking. Next, a woman named Charlotte materialized in the blackness in front of me. She seemed dazed and in shock. She became aware of my presence almost immediately and looked at me through a shell-shocked face and glazed-over eyes. I explained I'd been sent to bring her back home. I sensed that somewhere inside her it registered from her religious upbringing that when she died, someone was supposed to come for her. In her dazed state of shock, she was willing to go wherever I would take her. I reached out and took her by hand. Then we lifted off and flew away in the direction of the park. When we arrived, again out of habit, I tried to get an impression of the name of the person who met her there. Then I turned back toward the blast site. There were several more adults in rapid succession. A man named Ralph or Rob or something like that was the last one I felt I had time to identify. I was beginning to feel a bit overwhelmed by the sheer number of people I was encountering. I usually do this sort of thing with one person at a time, and there might be several days or weeks between such trips. As I moved back and forth from the blast site to the park, people's names and faces began to run together in my memory. At times I would come back more fully to awareness of my loud, noisy surroundings, sitting on the stool in the restaurant. Awareness of my activities at Oklahoma City would fade a little, and I'd be just eating my dinner or sipping my beer. Then the sights and sounds would begin to fade, and I'd be moving through the blackness again. Then he talks about a year and a half before when he was learning and researching at the Monroe Institute in Virginia, and how to assist in large-scale natural disasters. But that would be in a quiet and check unit, with nothing to disturb you. As I stood now at the Oklahoma City blast site peering into the blackness, I felt one of those helpers from the Indian experience a year and a half before, approached me from behind and recognized his voice. He suggested that I stop making trips back and forth to the reception center. "Bruce," he said, "just get their attention, get them to walk towards you," I felt him say. "As they move closer to you, helpers will step out from behind you to greet them. Let the helpers do the transporting. No sense you using up your valuable time with the trips. You're better at getting their attention than we are anyway. Remember how you used that ability to assist us in India? Just bring them in close and let us take care of the rest." Two more helpers then from that previous experience appeared suddenly, looking very like bright lights, and so bright as to be almost blinding. They took up positions on either side of me, and together they illuminated the blackness like two huge searchlights, making it easier to find victims of the blast. We began moving forward together, penetrating more deeply into the site. I quickly lost track of the numbers or names or anything else about the people we found who had been killed. I was so overwhelmed by the numbers that I gave up my old habit of gathering verifications. They came into view, I got their attention, and they moved towards us. As each approached, I could feel a helper standing close behind step out into view. taking the person by hand and talking softly and moving gently. They would move them off slowly, disappearing into the blackness. Then he meets another helper he knows from before, Rebecca, and describes her thus. Standing, smiling, her arms spread out in love, she was providing a portal that was draining off the emotional blackness of fear. By extending her love into the blast site, she was relieving the pressure, casting light into darkness. We acknowledged each other with smiles. As we continued searching, I became aware of something very strong, just a hint of a feeling at first, and then I realized it had been there all along, but I'd been able to ignore it until then. It must be something like what a firefighter experiences going into a burning building to rescue. At first, he's so busy trying to locate and rescue, he is barely aware of the surrounding maelstrom. If he stops to think about his surroundings, all of a sudden, he can see the flames and feel the heat. Firefighters probably know better than to stop and do such a thing. I'm not a firefighter. I didn't know. I stopped for a moment, naively opened up my awareness to the now strong feeling that I had only been dimly aware of. I realized immediately that it was an emotional energy of incredible power. Then, all of a sudden, man, could I feel the heat. The burning, searing power and intensity of these emotional energies was incredible. Grief and confusion was so strong that when they first hit me, I felt my awareness begin to quiver, wavering into unconsciousness. Unbelievably horrendous levels of grief, fear, anger, frustration, and rage surged through me. This part of the hidden treasure I was not prepared for. Instants passed like years as I struggled to push the door of my awareness closed against the tremendous pressure of these emotions. Finally, after I was able to move my attention away from the emotional energies of the blast site, I could stop and catch my breath. A moment later, he realizes that those powerful emotional energies, this quote, to which I had opened up, were not coming from the people I was assisting, but from physically alive people at the site and throughout the country. The bombing had forced the emotional energies of millions onto the blast sites. Rescue workers, victims' family members, and people around the world were all feeling frustration, anger, and grief, and more as they worked, waited, and watched. Those emotions were being projected into the blast site area because people's attention was focused there while they were feeling them. This is all true, and you'll have to learn how to do that because you will descend into a sort of panic, anger, grief pond of vibrations and drown. Well, not drown physically, but you know what I mean. Lose your focus, and you don't want to do that. Which is why, again, I would recommend you do not travel in your astral body, the body of emotion. Travel in your mental body, the body of thought. And then you will be lighter and less pulled by the heavier vibrations of emotion. Then this interesting thing here about people being pinned under concrete and whatnot. My awareness was jarred by the feeling of someone off to my right and downward, someone in the twisted pile of steel and broken concrete that had been the federal building. Those we had found so far had been sort of out in the open, easy to find and easy to move. Sensing where she was, we turned and approached the debris pile. I moved right up against it until I could feel its mass resisting further progress. I exerted slight forward pressure and overcame the resistance, and we pushed into the debris. Moving through it slowly, I scanned back and forth in front of me, trying to locate whoever it was I could feel. A few seconds after we entered the pile, we found her stretched face out, face down, surrounded and covered by broken chunks of the building. I stopped perhaps 15 feet away and called to get her attention. She looked at me and screamed, "Help me, get me out of here, something's fallen on my legs, I'm pinned down and my legs are stuck." She was very frightened, nearly hysterical. In the logical, tactless approach I was using at the time, I tried to explain her the bomb had gone off and she'd died. I could tell she thought I was nuts. As far as she was concerned, something heavy had fallen down on her and she was stuck. Nothing I could say was going to convince her otherwise. I was at a complete loss as to what to do to help her until someone suggested using a technique I'd learned on previous trips called seeing it not there. seeing it not there. Uh, Seeing it not there is not quite the same as making something disappear. I'd been taught the technique, and I knew that. I focused my attention on the debris pile surrounding the woman and began to see it not there. A spherical shape, perhaps 2 of her body lengths in diameter, began to take form around her. This ball shape replaced the debris with a dim whitish-grey light. In a few moments she was floating freely inside the ball. From her floating position it was a simple matter for her to move forward toward me. She was greeted by a helper who stepped out from behind where I was standing, and with a somewhat puzzled look on her face, she left with the helper. And he repeats that and repeats that. Throughout this experience, I'd been aware of my surroundings in Bennigan simultaneously with my activities in Oklahoma City. At times one area or the other would fade, though it never completely. Paid my bill, leaving a half-finished beer on the table, headed straight for my dream and drove home. Shortly after arriving home, I began to feel the way I do when I spend too much time out in the sun. It felt like radiation burns from exposure to the emotional energies at the blast site. These burns didn't show on the outside, they were emotional burns on the inside. Unlike sunburn, they burned more and more as time went by. Anxiety, sadness, frustration rolled over me like 20-foot breakers crashing on the beach. And he phones Rebecca, and they share. And as they share, he says, they were no longer waves of giant surf pounding on the beach. Instead, they became more like gigantic swells out at sea with rising crests and dropping troughs of intensity. I'd feel anger, rage, or frustration below me and rising upward with great power. A wave of emotion would pass upward through my body until I was completely submerged and overwhelmed by the feeling. This was not pleasant. At the peak of intensity, with the crest of a wave high above my head, I lose all emotional control. Grief, rage, the most prominent, were the most powerful and difficult to deal with. Throughout my confusion and disorientation, Rebecca and I continued to talk about experiences. After about 10 minutes, I calmed down and began to feel just physically exhausted. And then he basically collapses into bed. Those energies from Oklahoma City had been stuck to my non-physical body like hot black tar, and I'd carried them back into my physical world awareness. Too strong a dose of this stuff left in place too long can make a person physically ill. Luckily, I had previously experienced with this hot black tar and knew how to remove it. And he says he spends a couple of days, getting back to normal. And here's a little interesting line. Later he says, my preparation for trips to places like Oklahoma City now begins with an affirmation. Affirmation is, all my energy channels are clean, clear, open, and functioning perfectly. Any energies I encounter pass through me easily with no effect. Yes. I advise you to make yourself like a net waving in the air, like a butterfly net or any kind of a netting, something that the wind blows through, because that is best. Let energies of all kinds blow past you, blow through you, and you're unaffected. And it's an affirmation, that's all it is. And this reminds me of an interesting anecdote that I think you should hear. Way back then, when I was doing this work early on, I knew someone, not well, but I did know them. An acquaintance more than a friend, but an acquaintance with shared interests. And this person, at a certain point, decided to end their physical life. They were troubled in a number of ways, but I think the thing that got them going was an ongoing interaction with the alien beings he felt were Pleiadians. And he had a long history of abduction and wanted it to end. And at that point, this is 20 odd years ago. You would hear that traumatic stuff from abduction victims, and either you'd read about it or interviews or and I was focused on this area, and I did know people, and I didn't see him for a while. Then I heard through the grapevine that he had committed suicide, and the scuttlebutt was that his family didn't know, and no one spoke of it, the abduction scenario. They assumed depression from other sources. And as I say, I didn't know him that well, so there may have been other sources. But it was felt, when he spoke to me, it was not from the depths of gloom, but he obviously wasn't happy with his life and hadn't been for quite some time. And so at a certain point when I was doing the retrievals, actively on a regular basis, he showed up as sort of a helper, someone who would receive, and in an area that looked an awful lot like the park. And there are other reception areas other than the park and Focus 27, and you wind up working at several depending on various people's comfort levels. As you know, people have different cultural expectations and comfort levels. So, he would take people from me, and I'd say, "Oh, hi, how you doing?" And thanks, and we'd chuckle a little bit. And then another friend who was, physically alive at the time, who is now moved on, but again, this is 20 odd years ago. He was doing this work too. He had me sync tapes and was, using them and doing explorations. And he met, amongst other people, a person at Focus 27 at the park who, I can still remember what he told me. She seemed a little disgruntled and annoyed, and when he spoke with her, and she said, "I had to die to get here. How did you do it?" And I think she'd been in a car accident and was resentful. Maybe someone had hit her. And someone else as careless as not hers. She was a young woman. And he explained he was meditating and yada, yada, yada. And he interacted with her for a number of visits. And according to what he told me, she was getting emotionally involved with him. And he perceived her as an attractive young woman with needs. And he was a middle-aged man at the time, married. And they were getting involved. And this can happen when you project. It's not nearly as unusual as you might think it is. So they were getting involved, and he thought it would be wise to disentangle. And he told me that he met the other fellow that we knew, that we both knew him, and introduced him to her. And that seemed to work. She took her energies away from him and placed him on, not placed him, but, started getting friendly with the other fellow. And he told me this story with something of relief. And as the time went by, as months turned into years, I noticed at a certain point, again, this is quite in the far past, I can't remember completely the timeline on this, the man that I knew that I had interacted with, who was acting as a receiver, showed up with this woman, and they would do the work together. And then a while later, there was a child that they seemed to have. Obviously, you don't physically produce children in the afterlife, but there are all kinds of, dead children that you can adopt, who might be 2 or 3 years old, or even babies, and who don't need life as much, but they need parenting. They need love and parenting. So, and this was all affected. And this went on for quite some time. I would I didn't put it in any of my books because, as I say, this man's family didn't. We had heard through the grapevine, did not know of his that reason for ending his physical existence, and I didn't have that experience again. But it's an indication of how, as we interact with people over there, uh, relationships come and go, just like they do here. And again, the other man I was interacting with, he has since passed on from a lingering illness, and is, I have no worries about him particularly. He's fine, and was prepared for his transition and moved into it quite well. A little bit of history for you there that I always meant to talk about and never did. And with that, let's see if there's something we can do right now, as I've used up a fair bit of time telling stories. But, ultimately, everything is a story. The story of your life, the story of your lives, which become a multi-chapter story like a long novel, and the story of incarnation generally, and how every little story becomes a bigger story, and how every bigger story becomes a larger picture into which we all fit. The story of a life, the story of a family, the story of a soul, the story of a nation, the story of a planet. It's all stories. That takes us back to pre-technological times, when we would sit around after dinner and listen to stories. It's all a story. Okay, I've projected towards where we dropped off the ISIS fighter last night, I believe. And I'm putting out a vibrational call for him. But I'm not really getting a response. I'm sitting in the same area and just waiting to see if he'll show up. I could pursue him more aggressively, but I think for the sake of this exercise, I will be a little more passive and just put out a call and see if he responds. Yes, and as I sort of half suspected, the energy of his expectation of paradise has outweighed whatever effect I might have had on him yesterday. If he regards me at all, he regards me as some kind of servant. I don't think the word facilitator would come into his mind. And he's, somewhat overwhelmed by the experience, and whatever I did or affected is a very small part of his consciousness right now. But we'll come back again, and we'll have a little bit of an interaction with him, I am sure. And so as I tune into my consciousness in the projected state, I see a familiar scenario. You're at one place in the afterlife worlds, and you've either completed a task or an interaction, shall we say, and you're sort of wondering what to do next. And I mean, normally on an average night when I'm out there, I'm not wondering that hard about what to do next. I just enjoy the passing moments wherever I am. And sort of like you might have given somebody a ride somewhere and they've gone to do a couple of errands and you just sit in the car and, you know, relax, maybe listen to a bit of music and enjoy the moments as they pass by without any need to fret or hurry. And hopefully that's your experience. I know we all fret and hurry from time to time, but it's like that. And but of course, now that I'm sort of leading you on a merry chase through the afterlife worlds, hither and thither, doing this and that, as I focus on my consciousness there now, there's an edge of, well, what are we going to do next? um, and we'll see. Some of my correspondents since starting this series have expressed an interest in me, Gordon that's speaking to you now, hook up with some of his past lives, one or two or however many. And I, I responded by saying, yes, we'll get to that sometime. And maybe a quick interaction would be appropriate now. So I'm leaving my perch in this reception center and moving through the planes quickly. It's an instantaneous transfer, and I'm going to that high vibratory level beyond the paradise worlds, beyond the heaven worlds, the formless, beyond even the formless energy planes where the monads dwell. Monads, higher selves, source self, as I think Jane Roberts called it. Disc, as Bruce Moen called it, or perceived it anyway. He saw it like a large disc, almost like a flying saucer. Anyway, within the energy, the complex, deep energy of a monad, a higher self. The signatures, as Jacob Boehm, the medieval mystic, said, the signatures of all things exist. And the signature consciousness of past lives that are related to the life that's talking to you now are there. And of course, I've visited with them before. And some of that energy has gone on. This is just part of that energy that they retain to be the being that they were and represent that being for all eternity. And I just move into this lighted area and request that a certain being be present. As I say, they're not actively engaged in an incarnation. They're sort of, I don't know what to say, resting, dormant, but can be fully alive if needed, And I know it all sounds a little odd, but that's how I experience it. And when I was working on the book "You Are History," which details this sort of thing in quite a bit of detail, it could also, I mean, you can always go into it in more detail, but I went into it in as much detail as I felt I and the reader could handle at that time. And it is quite a revealing book, I might add. You are history, as we all are, because we've been in incarnation at all the, at many points in Earth history and in many cultures. And so, to that extent, we are representatives of history on this planet, as well as those who would study the history of life on this planet. So who is taking? Yes, the Egyptian priest. Somebody asked about the Egyptian priest. He appears in front of me and greets me warmly. Asks how my journey is unfolding. How are your attachments? He says to me. Oh, I thought that's interesting. I said, well, they're pretty active. And I explain how I'm quite attached to being a teacher and facilitator, as he was, and he nods, of course. Humanity does need its teachers. And the teachers, of course, need humanity. Without a semi-ignorant humanity, we would have not much to do. Isn't that right, Gord? And as I look into, his consciousness, I recall, many of the tasks I set myself in that life. One of which was trying to facilitate situations whereby the average citizen of ancient Egypt could contact and have interaction with their divine self, their higher self, without without the intermediary of belief systems, rituals, and priesthoods, which were a big deal in those days. And I was a priest in those days, but I sought to, over the long haul, that is, unhook myself from that attachment and show people how to contact their divine selves without intermediaries, without the complexity that was entailed in those times and in that culture. And it was a failing task. It did not work, and the other members, other priests, of which there were many, and various competing priesthoods wanted me on their side to be a promoter of their view, which I wouldn't do, and which I got punished for. And that punishment has long since passed me by in terms of an attachment, but I was attached at the time, and my Egyptian friend standing in front of me is nodding, that kind of wise nod where you're acknowledging foolishness in the past, but realizing that, as what was that Bob Dylan line? But I was so much older then. I'm younger than that now. That sort of rueful, bemused glance into one's murky past. And as he has said to me before, his main crime, his main fault at that point was impatience. He thought humanity was ready for this, and it wasn't. And the fact that other priesthoods oppressed him fought him and oppressed him in his desires, in his ambitions, was merely the manifestation of the group resistance on behalf of mankind then incarnate to that great leap. They weren't ready for it. Therefore, they manifested unconsciously the forces that would be against it. And for those of you who know the historically of the brief reign of Akhenaten and his attempts to change the course of Egyptian theology into a sort of monotheism, sort of early version of Christianity, which I won't go into deeply, but he did try, And there's evidence that you know it succeeded for his lifetime anyway, but then faded quickly back into the old ways. Um, uh, it's similar to that. The people weren't ready for it. The culture wasn't ready for it, but they were ready for a taste of it, but not until later were they ready. And even then, there was huge elements of paganism that had to be adopted and modified and transformed into the servicing of the new Christ energies on the planet. Um, and the gradual introduction of monotheism, the one God, as opposed to the many gods. Um, so the Egyptian priest figure has no regrets. He says, Gordon, I look to you. You're carrying on the work. You are, after your time as a druid and a Christian, you are now, and that's several incarnations, by the way, and that's not just one, um, uh, using modern technology to inspire and share and, you know, spread the word. And the word is Aum. The word is balance out your consciousness. Focus on the one divinity, the one humanity, the one planet, at least this one planet. Ascend in your consciousness to that sharing, that notion, that understanding that the one consciousness of humanity and the one consciousness of all sentient beings that share the planet with humanity is the one consciousness of Gaia. And as we move to planetary consciousness, bit by struggling bit, we will become comfortable with this. We will not lose our individual identities. We will not be subsumed in an anonymity that crushes and obliterates our struggles to become a fully conscious being. That fully conscious being will always be there and will always, you know, remain in light. But it will join the greater consciousness of Gaia, of divinity. The group consciousness that is God. The ongoing project to develop that planetary consciousness into the galactic consciousness and share as I am sharing now. So look at me and see who I am and see the Egyptian priest within me, because that is where he is. He has an independent existence, but he's also the energies that produced and projected him, produced and projected me, or some of the same energies. Imagine us in a pyramid, in the initiation chamber. Imagine the rituals surrounding our activity. Imagine them now. Imagine being lowered into the sarcophagus for 3 days. Imagine your time in there, your meditative time, and your eventual ability to project out of that calm, cool, darkened body, which is why you went in the sarcophagus in the first place. Imagine yourself projecting up, out through the pyramid, into the sky above, and staring amazed at the stars. You did it then, and you can do it now. And when you're done, I will still be here, waiting to greet you. So long, friends.